All right, let's now shift our attention to what is happening between Israel and Palestine. Now, there is a tenuous ceasefire that has come into effect between the State of Israel and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad group in a bid to end the three-day-long conflict. Now, this recent flare-up happened once the State of Israel resorted to what it described as a preemptive strike on certain targets of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories. The ceasefire was brokered by Egypt, and it has come into effect at 11:30 p.m. local time on Sunday. The Israeli strikes and the Gaza rockets have ceased after that, or at least that is the information that we are getting. And the visuals that you're looking at on your screens are the missile strikes that Israel has carried out in the Palestinian territories in the Gaza Strip. Now, the leader of the Palestinian group, meanwhile, has affirmed that their movement is still pretty strong even after the truce.
العدو الصهيوني رفع شعارا واضحا ومحددا، وهو تصفية حركة الجهاد الإسلامي وجناحها العسكري سرايا القدس. اليوم بعد توقف الاشتباكات وتوقف النار نرى المشهد واضحا. حركة الجهاد الإسلامي بقيت قوية وثابتة وأكثر قوة.
The sirens were heard and explosions were also seen above the Israeli city of Ashkelon just minutes before the truce was due to start. There was a similar sight in Tel Aviv as well. Israel, for its part, has said that it will respond very strongly if the ceasefire agreement is violated in any way whatsoever. Meanwhile, there was a sense of relief in the Palestinian territories once the truce came into effect. People came out onto the streets once the airstrikes by the Israelis stopped. Remember, Israel had said that it was carrying out what it described as precise strikes on targets of the Islamic Jihad. But the number of people who've been killed is said to be in excess of 40, including 15 children who've got nothing whatsoever to do with the conflict.
بدك الصراحة من ناحية الخوف ما في واحد من عمر أبو 10 سنين لعمر 70 سنة لما عاش الخوف. طبعا الخوف وارد لكل واحد. إذا ما خفنا من الضربات والصواريخ طبعا حتكون خايف على أخوك، على أمك، على أبوك، على جارك. كنا نخاف على الفقدان.
Now, the border crossing, meanwhile, has also reopened after days of closure following the unrest, and according to reports, fuel trucks have now resumed their deliveries into Gaza, thus ending the severe shortage of the supply of diesel that had powered the only power plant that was producing electricity for the Palestinian territory in the Gaza Strip. Remember, people in the Gaza Strip had been living with power outages where they had access to power only for about 8 hours in a day. Now, Israel unilaterally and preemptively launched this operation that it has described as Breaking Dawn on the 5th of August. Now, the Israeli forces claim that they've killed the Palestinian Islamic Jihad leaders Khalid Mansour and Taser al-Jabari in the missile strikes that they have carried out. Now, the entire operation was planned after Israel on the 1st of August had arrested the senior Palestinian Islamic Jihad leader Bassem al-Sadi from West Bank. An aide to Sadi was also arrested, and in the process there was a 17-year-old Palestinian teenager who was also killed. Now, Israel had then resorted to closing off the border crossing to the Gaza Strip before beginning the unilateral airstrikes from the 5th of August. Now, Israel says that it launched the operations due to an immediate threat from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. In response to the Israeli airstrikes, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad also resorted to firing the crude rockets that they have at their disposal towards Israel. Now, the Gaza officials have said that at least about 44 Palestinian people, including about 14 to 15 children, have been killed in these latest missile strikes by Israel. A number of Israelis have also been injured in the cross-border fighting, and the latest violence is the most serious flare-up between Israel and Gaza since the 11-day-long conflict that took place in 2021 that left more than 200 Palestinians dead, besides a dozen Israelis who also ended up losing their lives. So what is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad? Now, the group is said to be one of the largest Palestinian factions. It was founded back in the year 1981. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad is said to be allied to Hamas, but the groups have differences. Now, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad does not contest elections. It also does not recognize the state of Israel and calls for its overthrow. And Israel, of course, has branded the Palestinian Islamic Jihad as a terror organization. All right, now to give us more insights in terms of how the ceasefire is in fact holding out between Israel and the Gaza Strip, we are being joined in by David Matlin, who's joining us from Tel Aviv, who's also an international affairs expert. Now, Mr. Matlin, this is a ceasefire that has been brokered by the Egyptians. It has come after 3 days of intense missile strikes by Israel into Gaza. Tell us, has the ceasefire held?
Well, it came into effect just before midnight, and there were a lot of people across certainly central and southern Israel that were on edge, waiting to see. The initial ceasefire was announced at 8 p.m. That didn't hold. The next one came in again just before midnight. So I think since then we've seen relative quiet. From the Israeli side, it's a big relief. This was certainly not an operation anybody had been clamoring for or calling for. More flare-up or violence with the Gaza Strip. It's one of the last things anyone in Israel wants to see. But there was threats last week that had shut down roads across southern Israel. The intelligence reports that Islamic Jihad had been setting up to menace and actually fire anti-tank missiles at any target they could acquire across the border. By the third day of that, the IDF took this operation. So yeah, the public's been fairly supportive. It's good to see it wrap up.
All right, it's good to see it wrap up. But the question that a lot of people are asking is, now this has been described as a preemptive strike by the Israeli Prime Minister, where he said that they wanted to go in and take down these targets of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But if you look at the death toll that's in fact been inflicted as a result of the Israeli missile strikes, 44 people have died, including 15 children. That's a lot of collateral deaths, isn't it?
Look, it's from our perspective, after multiple rounds of intensive conflict with the Gaza Strip, it's tragic that anyone is being killed in this situation. We in Israel mourn the deaths of anyone in the Gaza Strip. This is not something that we seek or see as any kind of victory. But the facts are the facts that we're fighting an embedded terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip that very purposely and by design is hidden and embedded within civilian areas and civilian infrastructure. You mentioned the children killed in the Gaza Strip here, at least in some of the major incidents. The IDF, the Israel Defense Force, has been able to show video footage highlighting that many of these rockets, some of the 1,100 rockets that the Islamic Jihad fired into Israel indiscriminately in the last 3 days, some of those fell short. In fact, dozens of them fell short in the Gaza Strip, exploding in Gaza, some of them directly into civilian areas and directly correlated with when some of those children were killed. The IDF goes at great lengths to avoid hitting any civilians, especially children in the Gaza Strip, deploying very expensive smart munitions here with high levels of surveillance. In fact, they've also taken the unprecedented step of releasing footage from their aerial surveillance, showing multiple incidents where they held off on airstrikes because they saw civilians or children in the area. So the IDF is doing what it can to reduce that collateral damage, near impossible to fully avoid when you're fighting organizations such as the Islamic Jihad, embedded as they are in the civilian areas.
All right, now the Gaza Strip is not a very large territory. It's a very tiny strip of land, and we're given to understand that Israel had imposed a blockade on the Gaza Strip. It has now been lifted. The question that I want to ask you is, for people who are watching this from around the world, you know, how is it that groups such as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad are able to bring in the materials that are needed to make those crude rockets that they keep firing at Israel?
Yes, it's an astounding fact, as you highlight here. There's been a security blockade around the Gaza Strip since Hamas took over the territory nearly some 15 years ago, and it's enforced by Israel and Egypt. Important to mention here as well, Egypt shares an international border with the Gaza Strip as well. And in fact, most of the time, has more stringent and strict measures on that border than anything close to what Israel has in force. In fact, there are thousands of trucks a day that go through the Israeli border side, providing fuel, food, supplies, ensuring that there's no shortage of essential goods, medicine, anything like that in the Gaza Strip. So how they smuggle in weapons-grade material, which is what the security apparatus is all about preventing there, highlights their determination, highlights how good they are at acquiring those materials still. There's reported to be over the years many incidents of smuggling, certainly through the Egyptian side, but the Egyptians do work closely to try to eliminate that. But this is what they've become very good at, is getting around these security efforts. And they're very open as well about where their support comes from, the Islamic Jihad, the case being Iran.
All right, we'll have to leave there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Matlin, for joining us and getting us all those updates there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.